Hello, pattern readers. I hope you have seen episode 3 of The Rings of Power. I am going to be talking spoilers from that episode in this video, so if you're avoiding those spoilers, come back to this video after you've seen it. This is actually going to be a discussion of all my spoilery thoughts on the episode, but I do in particular want to focus on what's going on with Halbrand, because I feel like his character got way more interesting in this episode, and there's lots of theorizing about what's going on with him that I do want to discuss and break down. But let's start with some overall thoughts on this episode. Episode 3, Adar. I think the thing that probably stands out the most to me was the introduction to Numenor. I really loved actually everything about that. Even the score stood out to me. And of course, it is gorgeous. I just love the look of Numenor. And I particularly appreciated the way they're using color in the costumes, and the variety of costumes that we got to see in this setting was just really cool. I'm going to come back to talking in detail and depth about everything in the Numenor plotline, because I think that is what I had the most to say about in this episode. Since the other plot lines were a little bit lighter, I'm going to cover those first. Maybe a little bit surprisingly, since this is where the title of the episode came from, but I think I have the least to say about the Arondir plotline in this episode, which is not to say that I didn't like it. I actually really enjoyed it. And I will say that the actor playing Arondir, Ismael Cruz Cordova, is doing a really excellent job. And I was really impressed with the way he's able to emote so strongly with pretty limited dialogue. In general, he's not the most talkative character. And in this episode in particular, given the circumstances he's in, he has to do a lot without a ton of dialogue. I think the thing I appreciated here was that we're getting to see a kind of fairly extended sequence where you have elves and orcs interacting. This isn't just a, hey, these two groups of people are opposing each other, they're fighting, there's a battle, and that's it. We get to kind of see them interact, and there's actually work done in these scenes to build the tension and build the stakes of what we're seeing. They actually bothered to make us feel something for a tree, getting a little emotional when Arondir has to start chopping down that tree. So they've definitely done some good work there. And I just enjoyed the scenes. I think they were all really well done. And then there's Adar, whoever that is supposed to be, who we get a shot of at the end that's blurry. We don't actually get to see this person. But whoever it is someone who is commanding the orcs that they have some kind of reverence for. It is strongly, heavily suggested that this person might actually be Sauron, because there's mention of Sauron using different names. We know that he does do that. He goes under different guises. And so could this be Sauron? Of course it could, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think it's not super likely, because it's so heavily implied that it might be, and it's going to turn out to be one of his minions or something along those lines. Now let's talk about the Harfoots, and I think I have the most mixed feelings about this plot line in this particular episode. In general, I have been really enjoying the Harfoot scenes. The first episode I feel like is just kind of very introductory, not a lot is happening for them. The second episode I think is probably strongest, and this one, things get interesting, but I feel kind of mixed about it. So the biggest takeaway here for me in these scenes all has to do with them talking about the lost, the ones that they have left behind. And it's a very emotional scene there for a bit when they're naming these Harfoots that have been left behind. And the impression that I got there as they're naming them and talking about what happened is that these are all people who fell into a circumstance that they could not get out of, that they were forced to leave these people behind. But then when we get to the end of the episode and we see what's happening with Nori's family, her parents, Largo and Marigold, and they're at the back and they're very much at risk of being left behind. And there are other options. You can see very clearly here that there's nothing catastrophic or unavoidable here that means they would have to be left behind. It's a choice that they're making not to help each other in that way, which is very odd, for their culture is about like sticking together and helping each other. But at the same time, in these little individual family units, I guess if you can't hack it, you're just on your own. You're left at the back and no one is coming to help you. They do get some help from the stranger, which really supports Nori's whole point of, hey, let's help this guy. We don't know who he is or what he's about really, but he is someone who needs help and I'm going to help him, and it pays off for her. but it's very much at odds with their culture. And so I now have very mixed feelings about this culture. I'm not feeling so great about it, seeing what actually happens to people that are left behind. But it's so hard to sort of reconcile that with the personalities of these characters. Like Largo and Marigold are so sweet with each other. Nori's friend Poppy is so clever. I really love the scene with Poppy when she is helping Nori steal this piece of paper that might have information about the stars the stranger is looking for. And she's so clever in the way that she does it. And she just has some great lines too, where Nori is talking about how there's head sense and there's heart sense, and Poppy fires right back, no, there's common sense and there's nonsense. I mean, they might both have a point, but I just love the cleverness of Poppy and the friendship that she and Nori have. So it seems like these characters have ties to each other. They're so tight-knit, but at the same time, it's actually pretty harsh, their culture. So it's very surprising and sort of at odds with what I would really expect. Last couple of thoughts on the Harfoot plotline in this episode. I really think it's just a matter of time for Nori before she can't stay with this group and her family anymore. Not sure how that's going to happen or when, but it really could be any time now. And seeing how things went in this episode, I'd probably feel a little bit less badly about that when that eventually happens. And then there's the stranger. So let's talk about some of the theories about who the stranger might be. So one popular theory that I definitely don't think is right is that the stranger is Sauron. I just don't see that, okay? So even if you're gonna go with the idea that Sauron can be quite charming and not seeming evil, sure. And there's some odd things going on here, certainly with some strange powers and everything, but why would Sauron bother staging this whole thing and ingratiating himself to Harfoots of all people? Am I really supposed to believe that he would count these people as important and bother with them? I'm not buying it. So I don't see that at all. And then the next most popular theory broadly is that he is one of the wizards. I mentioned that even after seeing the first 2 episodes, and that was my immediate initial instinct for this character, is that he is a wizard. There are potentially 5 of them that he could be. The ones we're most familiar with are, of course, Gandalf, Sauron, Radagast, and then there's 2 blue wizards who are named and mentioned in the lore, but we really don't know much about them. So I think it could be any of these. I think a lot of people lean towards Gandalf for some good reasons, not least of which that we know Gandalf has a relationship with hobbits, so it makes sense here. But I don't think it has to be Gandalf. In a way, I'm kind of hoping it's not Gandalf, just because we know so much less about most of the other wizards, and it would be interesting to explore that a little bit more. I mean, my personal favorite would probably be that this is one of the blue wizards, because we know the least about them, and it's just a little bit more of a blank slate in terms of what happens with them in the lore. But I think any of the 5 wizards are possible, just not Sauron. Now let's talk about those Numenorian scenes, because these were definitely my favorite parts of the episode. One thing I loved is that they're showing us this society, which looks so beautiful, so marvelous. It seems like a paradise. And yet they're also letting us know that it actually isn't. And I think the strongest way that they're doing that is through these scenes that Halbrand has with this group of men. He's just trying to have a meal, have a drink, and they come over and they start calling him Low Man, an indication that he is a human, but not of the Numenorian race. He's not as long-lived as they are. Obviously not a great way to treat people. They obviously think that they are better. And their society is apparently thriving by being very isolationist. But we can probably predict that's not going to work out so great for them in the long run, thinking they can just ignore everything that's happening in Middle-earth and so on. We are introduced to a bunch of new characters, a lot of whom we're just kind of barely getting introduced to. So we have Elendil and his family, for instance. So that might be a little bit surprising to people that we're even seeing Elendil and Isildur and so on, but it's an indication of how much the show is condensing the time frame of the Second Age. They don't really let us know where we are in the Second Age in regards to the lore, but it's probably not that important because it's very clear they've had to condense it. We have seemingly Sauron is not openly established anywhere yet. He hasn't forged any rings yet, as far as we can tell. And yet Elendil and Isildur are going to have to be there when that ring gets cut off of Sauron's finger, which should be thousands of years. Clearly, we're condensing it to the lifetime of a Numenorian person. Say what you will about that. I think they could perhaps have delayed the introduction of Elendil and Isildur, but no matter what, I think they had to condense this because it just wouldn't work well to have thousands of years where you'd have to have time jumps where things aren't happening or they're happening off screen. I just think you needed to condense it to make it work in a TV show. Elendil is an interesting character. I think he's playing a role similar to what we would expect, where he is known in the lore to be one of the faithful who remained with good relationships towards the elves. And so he is fitting in that role. Clearly, that is not the popular opinion in Numenor right now, nor is it the official opinion. There are some indications here that if we go by what's happening in the lore, there might actually be a few more of the faithful that we've seen on screen. So if you don't want to hear some potential spoilers for what might be happening in this Numenorian plotline, go ahead and skip to this timestamp here. In the lore, Miriel and her father were among the faithful. They were the ones who did continue to have positive feelings towards the elves. It seems like she's at least keeping that under wraps if she does feel that way, presumably maybe because of the threat from Pharazôn. Here's a character that, again, if they follow the lore, when Miriel's father, the actual king at this point, dies, she should take the throne. But in the lore, she doesn't because Pharazôn actually takes it for himself and forces her to marry him. So we have that to look forward to. Seems like they might be going in that direction. And they have Miriel downplaying her true feelings towards elves in order to stay in political power. But the scene that she has with Elendil is an indication that she might actually have more positive feelings toward the elves, and she's looking to maybe make a little bit of an ally here with Elendil. Elendil's family, we get introduced to Isildur. There's mention of his other son, Anarion, and then we meet his daughter, Eärien. And they're kind of just sketches of characters at this point. We might guess at what might be to come, at least with Isildur. No idea about his sister. There's that one little odd moment with Isildur when he hears like a female voice saying his name. We don't know what that's about. Miriel, similarly, we're just kind of hinting at what her character might be. She has a really cool costume. And the main other thing that we get from her is that sort of somewhat intriguing scene between her and Elendil, and then a little hook at the end. We know her father is still king technically, but not allowed to rule openly, which is why they have established her as the queen regent at this point. That's a little bit of taking leeway with the lore, but it can fit into it. But the hook is, she says to him that, basically he's made a prediction. The elf has arrived, and that's going to have some significance. Not clear if he knew it would be Galadriel specifically or just any elf, but they are pulling from the lore there as well because her father, known as Palantir, had foresight. And so he did make these kinds of predictions in the lore. But the heart of these scenes, of course, is still Galadriel and Halbrand. So let's talk about those characters. Galadriel first. I noticed that a lot of people sometimes are having a hard time with Galadriel as a character. I hear a lot of common complaints that Galadriel is not likable as a character. Well, I have a little bit of an issue with this word choice in regards to a female character because I think that is the common expectation that female characters have to be likable. And of course, Galadriel, as a character, she doesn't smile a whole lot, except for in a weird moment when she's riding a horse that they made the slow-mo just a little too slow. But that aside, she's not a character who smiles a whole lot, but you wouldn't expect her to be. Think about what she is dealing with. She is the only person seemingly who is taking evil seriously. She has lost everything. She is so focused on this mission. If this were a male character, would you expect him to be smiling a lot? Would you expect him to necessarily be likable? Now, I'm not saying that everything that Galadriel does is the best choice for her. I do understand why she's kind of prickly towards the Numenorians, right? We get just a little hint of the history here. They don't allow elves in Numenor anymore, where they used to be great friends. Galadriel knows this history personally. So of course she's not happy about being there. Of course she's not feeling warm and friendly towards the Numenorians. Now, her actions, as Halbrand points out, aren't necessarily the smartest for getting what she wants, but it's understandable. Of course, she might seem rash and driven, but again, she's the only person taking evil seriously. That's kind of what you'd expect. She might seem arrogant, but she is thousands of years old, and no one around her in this episode is anywhere near that age or has any idea of what they're talking about as much as she does. So again, if this were a male character, I don't feel like anybody would be questioning this altogether. I still want Galadriel to develop as a character. I still want her to learn how to bring people into her mission, to actually form friends and allies and a fellowship, you might say. But that's part of her character development. So I hope that we will get there with her. But in the meantime, allow her to be unlikable. Not everyone has to be likable all the time. One thing I do wish the show would do a little bit better is explain to the audience why the elves are so hated. Why did this huge falling out with the Numenorians happen? I understand that there's a whole history here that they're probably not allowed to get into because they don't have the rights to. But if they could give us, as the audience, a little bit more to help us understand why elves are so hated generally among the Numenorians and among other humans, I think it would help us get on board a little bit with what's happening here. And then there's Halbrand. So I have to say, I really enjoyed Halbrand in this episode. I actually started to like him more, which maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing, remains to be seen here. But I did especially enjoy his scenes with Galadriel. I feel like the dynamic they're developing there, where they might push each other a little bit to develop as characters, could be really interesting. And the one question I really have at this point is, how genuine is Halbrand in his interactions with Galadriel? Because I think we've seen that he's not necessarily all that genuine in other cases. He's definitely calculating. We saw that in episode 2, where he's making this, quick judgment about, who do I align myself with when I'm stranded in the ocean so that I can survive? He doesn't have loyalty to anyone, but he's making a calculation about who he's going to join with. And we see that calculation in this episode as well in a different way, when he is, he has that moment where he almost loses it and he wants to fight these men, but he doesn't. He reins it in, and instead he's very charming. He buys them drinks. He tries to get out of it that way, and he almost does. In the end, when he has to fight, he wrecks those guys, so it's not like he couldn't. And we see that darkness that he's kind of keeping in. So, he is calculating. How calculating is he with Galadriel is the question. There's also the question, I suppose some people are talking about a possible romance happening there. I have to say I don't really see it going in that direction. I think that Galadriel wouldn't really let anything get in the way of what she is about. It's not to say that she can't have friends and allies, and I hope that she does. But I'd be surprised if we get a full-blown romance here, given the focus of Galadriel's character. I'm still interested in their dynamic, though, so I do want to see where that goes. As far as romance goes, I don't really see any true romances developing outside of Arondir and Bronwyn. The interesting thing there is we're not seeing them together anymore. It seems like they might be separate for a while. So instead, we have the setup of we establish them, they have the feelings, there's some longing. I don't think they've really acted on them. But then they're both thrust into these intense plot lines where they need to go through hardships, go through development separately until they finally come back together. Pretty effective potential setup for a romance there. So I see lots of good potential there. I don't really see it as much with Galadriel and Halbrand personally. But what's up with Halbrand? Is he okay? Should we like this guy? Some people, a lot of people, are questioning whether he is in fact Sauron, and I wanted to talk about that theory. There's a lot of good evidence to support it. Is there maybe a little bit too much, is really my question. So let's review. He's apparently very interested in forging, smithing, and very talented at it. Sauron forges the rings. He also has some business about his name. He's asked his name and he says it depends on how close we are. Of course, Sauron has different names that he goes by. And he has this symbol that he's wearing on this pouch around his neck. And he says he got it off of a dead man. So, is this like Halbrand, a stolen identity? Now, if he really were Sauron, why would he even want anyone to question that he is actually Halbrand if he's pretending to be? But then again, there's that darkness that he's restraining. And I think that's the most interesting aspect of it. We do know that Sauron is supposed to have been at one point charming, not evil presenting, able to try and gain influence among people without just trying to crush them. So I would actually like to see that whoever Sauron turns out to be is someone that we could actually like. And they are establishing that here with Halbrand. On the other hand, I really think there's just a bit too much here. And it's not a rarely picked up upon little clue here. This is very widely talked about. So I tend to think these things are maybe a little bit of red herrings and he's not actually Sauron. But I do think they're setting up a plot line where he could try and reclaim his kingdom, and he could end up being one of the 9 humans that Sauron gifts a ring to and ends up becoming one of the ring wraiths. I think that has a lot more potential as an arc for his character. Would be tragic, would be interesting. I'm leaning more in that direction than him being Sauron. I also think it allows for, again, an interesting dynamic to develop between Halbrand and Galadriel over a period of time where they perhaps become friends, where they influence each other, they grow and develop in their arcs. And, there might be a tragic end to it, but it could still be really compelling to watch. And I don't think we would get maybe as much of that if he ends up being Sauron. I think it's just a little bit too on the nose. So I want to hear your thoughts on this episode and on the show overall. How much has it hooked you so far? And give me your theories. So who do you think the stranger is? Who do you think Halbrand is? If it's neither of those, do you have any theories on where Sauron is and what he's up to? Do you think that he is Adar, or maybe something that we just haven't seen yet? If you enjoyed this video, please leave me a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and I hope to see you back next time.